Okay, good. And our internet consultant,
Jennifer.
Jennifer, very good. And our graph use,
Lucy.
Lucy. Very good. Excellent. Okay, we've got lots to talk about. So, John, take it away.
Topic of discussion today is to basically compare and contrast Mark and Matthew. So let's start with the birth of Jesus. We go here. Do you have any burning comments?
So Matthew had it, Mark did.
Okay.
And I mean, Mark starts with, he's in Mark, like in Mark 4, it starts with, like when Jesus meets John the baptizer in the forest. While in Matthew, like he does a whole genealogy and even talks about the Immaculate Conception on Matthew 1, and then it goes into his early childhood, which just isn't included in Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's a lot about, I thought it was interesting, a lot about dreams, the Lord appearing in dreams to Joseph when Jesus was a child, which is something that's certainly not included in Mark, and I just think it's interesting, is his father, this emphasis on his father and his genealogy as well. Okay.
Did anyone else kind of think it was like a little ironic that Abraham or God, I guess, is he referred to God now, or is he still Yahweh or the God of Abraham?
God of Abraham.
Okay, so when the God of Abraham, as Casey was saying, like comes to Joseph in a dream and tells him to go to Egypt. I just felt that was kind of ironic that, a couple of generations before, he was like told to go there, and then there's the Exodus from Egypt. So I just thought that was interesting. Like they went there for asylum because Herod was in search for them, as it says in Matthew 3 verses 13 through 15.
Why do you guys think that Matthew, or if it wasn't actually Matthew, the tax collector, why do you guys think that the author of Matthew decided to include the genealogy at the beginning to start out his book? Anyone?
I think it gives credibility to Jesus. Just like builds him up as a figure who, like, even though, like I said the other day, like even though he's advocating these strange new things, he's very much tied into like their familiar heritage, and like even more so like the like really respected people like David of their heritage. I think it just serves to legitimize Jesus.
Because do you guys know if Matthew was written like for Hebrews? Okay. I don't know, for some reason I thought that it was written primarily for the Hebrew population, but I could be wrong. And so I thought that that's why there was such an emphasis on the genealogy to prove, that like he has a direct lineage with David. And so that's like in accordance with the prophecies.
Because Matthew is the first book in the New Testament.
Does anyone know anything about the authorship? I know Mark was the earliest the Gospels written.
Yeah, like on page 1746, like that whole introduction section, it talks about how it was like they don't know who, but they have like assigned to them letters. And so the writer of Matthew said to be Q, and then they have this chart that says, shows like relations. They believe that there are three main authors, M, Q, and L, and how like they believe some of them wrote parts of some and some of others, and then just kind of compiled them. I guess that's the.
It's kind of interesting because that's really similar to like in the Old Testament when you have like the J source and the P source. It's kind of interesting.
Well, my understanding of how they assemble this is just like using basically a bunch of fragmented letters and whole, like of the plenary session, you showed the picture of all the like the basically destroyed document. So I think they take from myriad of sources to try and tell a cohesive story. Do you want to move on to this period of teaching Jesus?
Well, there's one more section that I thought was kind of important in Matthew. It's at the end of Matthew 3, right after he's been baptized by John, and Matthew 3:16. It talks about how suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." And I mean, I feel like that's something very significant that that is also included in Mark. And like again, like as we were talking about earlier, that helps legitimize their claims and stuff.
Just we're talking about this sort of his childhood being like a legitimizing factor, right, for him. Something that it just struck me that was interesting is there are a couple incidents here in Matthew where the Lord sends dreams to Joseph, and like Joseph is the dreamer in Genesis, so it just seems to me like there's a connection there. I thought was interesting.
I may be completely wrong, but I think the name Joseph means
Yeah,
dreamer.
it's
Yeah,
It establishes that.
Yeah.
But that's the name. Yeah.
That's one question I was kind of confused about names. It says in Matthew 1, when the angel was coming unto Mary, it says, "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God with us. Joseph awoke from his sleep. He did as the angel had commanded him, to took her as his wife, but bore no marital relation with her until he was born and named the son Jesus. Like, why does he switch the name from Emmanuel to Jesus? When he was like commanded, he says, "All right, I'll do this," but then calls him a completely different name.
No, I had that same.
Where's that again? Oh,
It's Matthew
For
1:22.
So, in the footnote, it says the angels reference Jesus saving his people probably leads to Jesus' name. I don't really understand that connection, but that's to explain it.
Can you like look up what like Jesus means, I guess, in Hebrew? Or...
yeah. That's Do we want to do wiki or naming?
What are we consulting?
We're talking about the name of Jesus because in Matthew 1, it's talking about how the prophet said that they shall call him Emmanuel, and yet Joseph decides to name him Jesus. And so we
Right, Jesus. As you will read in a note there, Jesus is a shortened form of Joshua, actually.
And what does Joshua mean?
If you go to here, we'll find this for you.
It says,
Yeah, what does it say?
it says the Lord is hope for salvation.
That's what
Yes.
Joseph means?
No,
Or Joshua?
Yeah.
He's talking about Emmanuel. It's nice and all, but it still doesn't mean God is with us, according to
Emmanuel means God is with us?
Yes.
Yeah, according to Matthew 1:1-2.
So they're kind of like
Yeah.
different meanings. So
Yeah, that's weird. Yeah. Something that I thought was kind of odd, just like reading through Matthew and then looking back at Mark, was that a lot of the same things happened, but in a different order.
Yeah.
Like some things that happened in Mark after certain events happened before them in Matthew. I just thought that was interesting that they were almost the same. Like some of them were described word for
Like,
word
even,
in the
like,
same way,
verb
but they
tense.
just happened in different ways.
Even like past, present, like that changes like all the time.
Yeah.
And it's just like that might have to do with like the letters and like one letter's written in the past, one's future, or excuse me, present. But that was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Like
Anybody have any insight on that?
I'm trying to do something.
Like an example kind of that is in Matthew 5:13, there's that salt analogy again.
Yeah.
That comes up in the end of Mark. And like this one seems a little more clear, but it's just interesting that like that analogy arises again. I mean, from what my understanding of like that old antiquity is like salt was more valuable than gold.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I guess like that just shows its importance in that time.
Yeah. And then like one of the things that I saw in Matthew 13, they tell the story of Jesus going to the sea and getting on the boat because there were so many people standing on the beach. And that happened in Mark 4, I think, before all the stuff that Matthew has just said happened. So it's just weird that that event happened after a bunch of stuff. I don't know. I think that's an interesting thing about the text. Because they're the same stories. So, you know, was he writing these stories because that's what happened or because he saw it in Mark? And like, I don't know, that was interesting.
Or do you think he has like a different objective?
Yeah, I don't know. Because it didn't seem, yeah, that's one of the things about it that struck me as peculiar is because the positioning of the stories in a different order didn't seem to change the meaning of them that much. Yeah, I don't know. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I mean, this isn't really like backed up, but at my Catholic high school, I know we were taught that the differences between the narratives proves that, or like bolsters their reliability because they didn't exactly remember every detail together. Like it wasn't like basically the differences, the small differences with the stories were told indicated that it really was, you know, each individual writing it out as they remembered it instead of you know 4 people collaborating together like let's create a series of events and let's, you know, create this whole conspiracy story and just spread it around. The fact that there were like national variations and the fact that just memory can't be perfect in general indicated that like they really were like recalling from their memory.
That's interesting. That's an interesting idea. I have trouble with that because there are some things that are word for word the same, which seems to like sort of dispute that. Or the story of in both Matthew and Mark, in Matthew 17 and Mark 9, where Jesus goes up on the mountain and he talks to Moses and Elijah. That happens in both of them, and both times he's like, okay, but don't tell anyone until after I've been raised from the dead. That's important. So obviously the person writing this wasn't there for that. It doesn't seem like it seems like it's a retelling of that story. It's almost an identical retelling of it. So.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
What's another explanation for this? Jennifer, you brought one up that these people are remembering essentially the same things but in slightly different ways. What's another explanation for that?
Well, it's here in the book, just that Matthew drew from Mark and other sources, and then Luke drew from both of those two and other sources too, to create separate but similar stories.
So you're saying it's different because he's using Mark, but he's using other sources as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's like a little chart for the Gospel of Matthew, I think.
Right, there's on page
1745.
1745. You will see here a little chart there in the upper right-hand corner is Q, right? Q is a source that of writings from which both Luke and Matthew draw. And then we also, so Mark is also a collection. This is the reason why we're reading Matthew after Mark, because Matthew is drawing on Mark. What essentially you have is a set of stories, but now that it's 50, 60 years after the death of Jesus, people are trying to come up with some sequence of these stories that makes sense. And so they will appear in different places. They remember these sayings. They're sort of compilations of Jesus' sayings and little anecdotes about Jesus' life that are circulating, from which the Q source draws, as well as Mark. But now these people, again, almost 2 generations after the life of Jesus, are trying to make sense of them in some way. And so that will account for the different orderings. So essentially you have these compilations of Jesus' sayings and events in his life that people are compiling in different ways in what they think makes sense.
Just like interesting thought that I just had is, like, probably people that thought that Jesus would come back sometime in his life probably didn't really want to spend their time, like, taking detailed notes in like a history, because he didn't think he would share.
Didn't need to give it to anyone. Yeah. That's
So,
interesting.
just, something to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like Jesus himself says a couple of times, one of the times in Matthew 5:17, from that time Jesus began to proclaim, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. And he was kind of backing up what Paul was saying, that it's coming soon.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of sounds like one of those guys that's on the street corner with the cardboard signs.
I don't know.
And he
That's an
actually,
ambiguous
they actually
statement,
talk
though.
about that in where he's talking about in, I think it's Matthew 7. He talks to the hypocrites and how, or maybe it was
7, because it's talking about your neighbor's dog.
yeah, and it talks about how like Jesus doesn't want his followers to be like hypocrites, like some of them, and how he wants them to actually be like pious when they go to synagogue and like when they give alms, give fully and things like that.
Yeah. Something else that really struck me about a difference between Matthew and Mark too was Mark seemed to be a lot of what was written is sort of Jesus' actions, his healings, right? A lot about the people he healed and things like that. While Matthew seems to have a greater emphasis on his teaching, like what he actually said. There's a lot of that, a lot of his evaluations of the commandments, for one. Yeah, like in 5. And I thought that was interesting. And it also struck me that specifically there seemed to be a great emphasis in Matthew, Jesus having said on forgiveness. Like that came up a lot. It comes up in 5:39, 6, 14 through 15, and 7, 1 through 2, and then in the whole story of Judas, because in Mark he just sort of touches on that, but in Matthew he not only has a detail where Jesus says, do what you have to do, right? But he also has just sort of like Judas trying to take it back, sort of. So I thought that was interesting.
Do you think there's a reason behind that, or just
I think that it was just sort of part of the mission, I guess, of this book, to sort of talk about the teachings of Jesus, and I think that that it emphasizes the idea of forgiveness. Yeah, that's.
You know, so any ideas? I think it's just kind of like choice of detail. I don't
Yeah,
think there's
yeah.
really some ulterior motive or anything like that. But anyways.
Well, because we talked about judgment last class, right? Because what in Romans, Paul writes about not judging people. Is that right? Is it in Romans? Yeah, I think. And so, it's sort of the same sort of idea, right? That it's almost not your place as people.
Let me introduce a point here, and that is that these documents that we're looking at become the foundational documents of a religious movement that has affected billions of people and animates lives today. These are very serious documents. There's nothing incidental about them, all right? They play such an important thing, and so I think that when we look at these differences, we have to ask ourselves, why are they different, right? It's not just serendipity. It's not just, you know, oh, I thought this would be important and that wouldn't be important. These all have that. We think of the Gospels, and I think Jennifer's experience is illustrative of this. We think of these God stories because we talked about how a meeting is a function of differences. So the fact that, I mean, Casey has been pointing out some of these, dreams only appear in Matthew. Okay? Nobody else is dreaming in the gospel stories, only in Matthew. We only get the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, right? We only get the story of Lazarus, for example, that came up on the quiz in John, right? So these are individual details that have definite meaning for us, and we ought to try to figure them out. I mean, identifying them and seeing what they are is the first step. But what do they mean? What is their significance? I do think what you've said about forgiveness and the redemptive aspects of Jesus is very Pauline. I mean, we can see that is a major part of what Paul wanted to say, and we can see it even more in this. In the Matthew, where essentially Paul, or this gospel, is connecting Jesus far more aggressively to the Hebrew heritage, not just any Hebrew heritage, but a messianic heritage that goes back to David. And that's an enormously important aspect of this that I think you can see the influence of Paul in. So let's explore some more of these differences, and what do you think they might suggest?
Yeah, I mean, one that I really kind of noticed that was kind of glaring throughout Matthew is that it seemed very, very creatively written. Like there's a lot of use of like metaphors and similes, and just kind of a little more like flowery language than I saw throughout Mark. And so, I mean, the way I kind of took that to mean was like they wanted it to seem like more colloquial, like more like interesting, so people would remember it and who are reading it, and then take the tenets away. Similar to how they used stained glass windows in the medieval period. They would like just put the stories on these windows because most of the population was illiterate. So. And then that was the way that they taught, was like you looking at the windows, and then the preacher would tell the story, and then they would relate that to the windows.
So are you saying that it's almost like a purpose association with something sort of beautiful and the story,
Yeah.
so that you associate?
Do you
That's an
think,
interesting idea.
well, like, was Matthew written as a religious text or something else? I don't know what I'm asking. Well, because, like, my train of thought is that if it was written as, like, maybe a religious text, like, writing to a different audience obviously changes the style of writing. Do you think that's the reason why it's more flowery or whatever?
Yeah, as part of the persuasiveness of it. I think that's sort of what you were saying about comparing it to this like positive beauty.
Yeah.
It's also sort of something different, like he's telling the same story, or a lot of the same stories as in Mark, and so he needs to do something to kind of like put his own, like, again, my history class, we talk about how time progresses, you're constantly thinking like, what's next? So like he's telling the same story, but like how can he make it different, and like what's the progression from there? Does that be written later? What comes next? And like so maybe like adding more creative things. He sort of like learns the mistakes and the more creative thing makes it more memorable. So it's also sort of like, I think in my plans, like just how things progress,
Yeah.
how over time it evolves.
there was a specific wording difference that I noticed, and I want to know if anyone else saw something like it, or has a thought about sort of what it says. And it's in the story where there's someone's mother-in-law is sick and he goes to heal her. That in Matthew 8:15, it says he touched her hand and the fever left her and she got up and began to serve him. And in Mark 1:31, it says then the fever left her and she began to serve them. So in Mark it says she began to serve them, and in Matthew it began to serve him. Yeah, I thought that was interesting because when I read it, I marked it when I read it in Mark because I thought it was funny that she was really sick and she got up and in my head she was like, oh, have some food. Like she just started serving them. But the serve him in Matthew struck me very differently. It struck me in sort of a larger religious serve him context.
It kind of solidifies like Matthew being more of a religious text, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Who is this woman?
It's Peter's mother, so it's
Mother-in-law, yeah.
well, when Jesus entered Peter's house, this is Matthew 8:14. He saw his mother-in-law laying in bed with a fever. So that's Jesus' mother-in-law.
Yeah, no. In Mark,
It's Peter.
in Mark,
Peter's mother-in-law.
yeah, in Mark 1:29, or what? In Mark 1:30, Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with him.
Yeah, that confused me at first too. It seemed like it was Jesus.
Yeah.
That's not.
All right. So what do you think that means?
Well, I don't know, if we're kind of going with Matthew being a more religious text, making...
Wait a minute, more religious text?
Well,
What
like,
do you mean by that?
if Matthew was written as a, I don't know, kind of if the author had some sort of religious motive behind it or something, you know, he would...
All of these documents have a religious motive behind it. that is absolutely indisputable, right?
Yeah, more so than Mark is what I'm trying to say. Like, to me, it seems like Mark was so soon after Jesus was running around that it was more of just kind of like, more like a diary almost. Not a diary. I don't know what to say.
Maybe you have fewer sources to draw.
Yeah. And then with Matthew's, like more of, kind of like a
More full
worldly
Maybe.
or...
Well, so Matthew was written after Mark, and Matthew was compiled from or written with a lot of sources, Mark included, right?
Mhm.
So maybe there is sort of a more sophisticated understanding of what this means. I don't know that, but I think that sort of goes along with what you're saying, that the more time has passed.
Yeah.
So and he has more sources. So he's sort of assembling a differently sophisticated text of what exactly the new religious connotations are.
Yes.
I know this is jumping ahead a little bit, but since it's less than 10 minutes, can we maybe talk about the events around the time of his death and how that compares between Matthew and Mark? Because, this is really obvious that Matthew has a much longer narrative of the events surrounding his death, especially regarding the events with Judas. It still includes the segment on Peter and the rooster crowing, which is really substantive in Mark, but it also includes a lot of other information as well, especially regarding Judas. So aside from just length, what differences do you guys find between Matthew and Mark?
Some examples could be are there stylistic differences?
Are there content differences? Are there thematic differences? Maybe the context of how they seem to be written is different.
Well, at the very end of Mark 16, it's way less flowery, which we talked about earlier, but it's just like they saw a young man dressed in a white robe. And then in Matthew 28, there was an earthquake, which is like way different. And it's not just a young man, it's an angel descending from heaven. And he sat on the stone. So there's a lot more details, which makes me think he was trying to make it way more exciting for a reason.
Do you think that's because the author just like had more stuff to pull from, or?
Well, in my opinion, it seems like he just wanted it to be more interesting to read, so people wanted to like Jesus more.
But it does give more grandeur to the resurrection.
I mean, it's not really details that would change with more information. It's details that like are just cooler.
Yeah.
Those are the showmanship.
Yeah.
We'll see if maybe some of those details relate back to something in Hebrew text, since you know that Matthew is writing for a Hebrew audience. Like maybe those have more significance than just to be flowery details. One way you can look and see if there is like a textual reference is to look at these annotations and stuff on the side and on the bottom, and see if it refers back to anything in like Isaiah or Kings or something like that.
Where was the earthquake?
Matthew 28, like beginning, the second.
Oh yeah, 1928 too.
So Mark is not written for Hebrews? Is that what? Or was it also?
It's Matthew definitely is.
Oh, okay.
All right, you're definitely on the right track looking at some of these differences. Thank you, Jennifer, for bringing this up. The Mark, as we have seen, for Mark, the resurrection, and remember that this probably reflects a view or an understanding of Jesus and his role. The resurrection is not that important, is not as important in Mark as it is in Matthew. I mean, Matthew makes it an earthquake, and there's the appearance of angels, right? I mean, this is a much bigger thing. Now, there's also a very big difference in terms of the stories surrounding the fact that there doesn't seem to be a body anymore. What are they in Matthew? What comes up in Matthew in two specific places that's very different than Mark? What does Pilate order them to do? Look in Matthew 27, verses 62 and following.
He orders soldiers to go and guard the tomb.
Yeah, why?
To make sure his disciples would not come and steal the body, and so they could bury it in their own way.
So that they could prove that he had really died.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
So there's no if someone's guarding the tomb, then for sure something miraculous happened. It's not like someone just came in.
Well, were they thinking about miracles, or was he thinking about someone stealing it?
Well, read it. Let's figure out. Right there. Open it up. It's verse 62. Read a few verses there. 62 to 66.
The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember what that impostor said while he was still alive. After 2 days I will rise again. Therefore command the tomb be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may go and steal him away and tell the people, he has been raised from the dead, and the last deception would be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers, go. Make it as secure as you can." They want the guard to make the tomb as secure by sealing the stone.
Now go to Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15.
While they were going, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests everything that had happened. After the priests had assembled with the elders, they devised a plan to give a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, "You must say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story is still told among the Jews to this day.
Okay, so what has happened?
So Pilate is just trying to.
What has happened between the time of Mark and Matthew?
People have started saying that it wasn't a resurrection, that someone just came and took the body. So now Matthew writes, that's not what happened. Yeah. So there's been, in the time between they were written, there's been like skepticism about the story. So Matthew adds details to the story to reaffirm.
Validate. What does it mean when it says, and this is in 28 verse 64, the tail end, the last deception will be worse than the first?
Like that his idea of being able to be resurrected from the dead would be more of a lasting image and like create a lasting impression on like people than what he said in the beginning. I think he's just like concerned about his power base being challenged by the ideas of Christ.
And being able to raise yourself from the dead is a much bigger miracle than like curing someone with leprosy.
Yeah.
Well, we've seen that there are rival claims of this sort of thing, of resurrection, of being able to overcome death. All right. So what he's saying is that, look, if Jesus' disciples manage to steal his body and are able to disseminate the idea that he's actually resurrected, that's a far greater fraud, okay, from their perspective, potentially, than just a person saying that I have defeated death. As Professor Ulici said, those were not. That claim was not restricted or limited to just what Jesus and his followers were saying. The whole issue of overcoming death is one that's animated a lot of people. Right?
Well, guys, we're out of time. It's been a good discussion, I think.
Yeah. Could you hit end broadcast?
I will see you on Monday. All right. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Good to see you.